Okay, so this is the first of two videos that we're going to do to finish the ancient Greek material. We are, with this one, looking at the rest of the High Classical period. So we're going to center on the Acropolis in Athens, which is the most sort of emblematic monument of the city of Athens, and maybe even of ancient Greece as a whole. The complex at the Acropolis got going in the Neolithic period. It was sort of a city that was built up on a hill. It transformed over time into this kind of ritual center that was dedicated to Athens' patron goddess, who was Athena, hence the name, of course. And it becomes a religious and ceremonial center for Athenian life. Now, in 480 BCE, as a product of the kind of constant warfare between the ancient Greek city-states and the Persian Empire, the Acropolis is actually destroyed. So Persians come in and they raze the site to the ground. And rather than leave it sort of in ruin, the Athenian leader, whose name is Pericles, decides that he's going to rebuild this site as like a testament to the resilience of Athens and its democracy in the face of destruction by the Persian Empire. So the purpose of the rebuilding here has a couple of sort of angles. One is to kind of honor the gods, another is to symbolize Athenian triumph, and another is just to have a sort of visual expression of Athenian values and civic pride. And notably, Pericles actually employs his friend, who is the sculptor Pheidias, in order to work on the buildings at the Acropolis. The Acropolis itself, as it's being rebuilt, is extremely expensive. Pericles and the other people involved with the rebuilding had to import marble and wood and gold from places outside the city of Athens. So he spent a ton of money on this thing. And in fact, Pericles' enemies, his political enemies, criticized this great expense. You know, like, why is he spending so much money on building the Acropolis? But tellingly, I think, he never lost support of the Athenian people. So they really did understand this, I think, as a symbol of their own civic pride, and they supported its building throughout the kind of phases that it went through. So just to let you know what we're going to, your book kind of sets this out and it categorizes the Acropolis according to sort of sculpture and buildings, but I'm going to take you through it in a way that a visitor to the site would have experienced. So we're going to look at this kind of monumental staircase in the entranceway. We will briefly look at one of the sculptures from this small temple here, which is the temple to Athena Nike. You see it right over there. And then we're going to go to sort of move up through this area. The visitor would have encountered a statue of the goddess of Athena here, which is no longer extant. And then we're going to sort of encounter a couple of different buildings. Notice that if you were to visit the site, you would either sort of come around this way, or you would walk around this way in order to visit the Parthenon, which is the temple dedicated to Athena specifically as a patroness of Athens. So either way, you're going to approach it at this kind of oblique angle. And that's similar to the angle at which we saw the site at Aegina set up. So again, instead of giving you this sort of frontal monumental presentation of the temple, ancient Greek architects and sort of planners wanted you to experience this thing at an angle and to sort of see it from all sides, and really almost as like a very grand work of sculpture. So after we check out the Parthenon, we're going to move over here and take a look at this building, which is a smaller temple. It's called the Erechtheion, and it's dedicated to several different gods. So that's just kind of the pathway that we're going to see as we move through this building. So to start us off, here is a monumental entrance to the Acropolis. So that's that big grand stairway that we just saw. There's another sort of reconstruction here. You'll notice that over to this side, kind of off the picture frame, but you can see it here, there was a lower kind of a building. Originally this was used for a kind of dining hall, and then it got transformed into the first known museum that actually exhibited paintings that were put on display for public view. So it's one of the things that happened in this kind of subsidiary building here. Over on the right, which is the south side of the complex, we have a smaller temple that's dedicated to Athena Nike, which is the Athena as sort of an embodiment of victory. And you can see that right here in the photograph. We have a new architectural order that's being presented in this building. It is the Ionic architectural order, which we will talk about as the lecture continues. Notice that the actual monumental entrance itself doesn't have any monumental sculpture on its friezes. It is, of course, decorated, so we have this sort of painted, decorated building. It is Doric with its sort of large, kind of squatly proportioned columns, and then the alternation of triglyphs in metopes. So that's sort of an identifying feature of this entrance. The scale, however, is pretty intense. It sort of dwarfs and swallows up the visitors who approach it through this very grand staircase. If you were able to sort of visit the Temple of Athena Nike at the time that the Acropolis was being built, you would notice that it has architectural sculpture from the parapet, which is like a low retaining wall around the temple enclosure. And so this sculptural frieze had, as one could imagine, many winged victory figures who are known as Nikes that form a part of the sculpture. This is one of those Nikes that we see in a kind of an interesting pose. She's actually reaching down to adjust her sandal here. Notice even though that her body is sort of inclined toward the sandal, that she has these large wings on the other side that very much balance out the composition. So this is, even though she's a little bit off kilter, her wings back here sort of stabilize her. Another thing to sort of notice about this sculpture is how textured the garment has become. And how very, very light and gauzy it looks. You can really see the form of this Nike's body underneath the garment that she's wearing. A final thing to just sort of notice again about the sculpture is that even though we have the ancient the sort of classical value that women need to be clothed, right? You don't show women who are nude in ancient Greek sculpture, at least not for a while, as we'll see in the next video. But here this garment has been allowed to just sort of slip off her shoulder a little bit, and you can very much see the sort of outline of her breast and even the nipple here that is a part of this aesthetic. So she's fully clothed, but there's a sort of eroticism that's allowed into this image that has to do with the clinging thin garment she's wearing and also the slippage down her shoulder. Moving along, we are encountering the Parthenon, which is of course the temple to Athena, the sort of main temple that is in the Acropolis. Just like that monumental entrance, we have a Doric facade here, with plain capitals and a frieze that alternates triglyphs and metopes, just like we saw at Aegina. We're also noticing on the plan that we have that typical peristyle kind of colonnade that forms the perimeter of this temple building, and then we have a smaller kind of the cella, which is located inside that peristyle colonnade. So here's where the statue of the goddess would have been housed. We have a kind of an interior room or a porch that we haven't seen before, and this was, we think, used at the Acropolis as a kind of a treasury. So the entire building of the Parthenon is made out of fine white marble. This is a very expensive material. It's a very prestigious kind of material as well. And your book notes that the planning and execution of this building, both in terms of architecture, the sort of engineering, and the sculpture that is housed on its friezes, would have required a team of very highly trained engineers and architects, sculptors, and painters. So this is not unlike other very monumental buildings that we've seen, such as the pyramids. This is a building that required a very educated, knowledgeable construction force. One of the most important things about the Parthenon is that it is very much about ratio. There's a ratio of 4 to 9 that is maintained throughout the building. 4 to 9 is the relationship of the breadth and length. So the breadth over here, so this would be a ratio of 4, and this would be the ratio of 9. 4 to 9 is also maintained in terms of the relationship between the diameter of a column to the space between those columns. So we can think about this as being very similar to the idea of canonization of the Greek figure. So just like Greek theorists are thinking about, what are the best ideal ways to depict the proportions of the human body, so Greek architects are are thinking about the ideal proportions for buildings, and they're presented to you as the viewer. You're supposed to understand and intellectually engage with those sorts of proportions, to notice them and appreciate them. And in fact, there are books that were written by the ancient Greeks that extol the beautiful sort of proportions of this building. So they themselves noticed and engaged with art on this very theoretical kind of a level. Just like we saw at the temple of Aphaea at Aegina, however, we have some deviations from regularity that help kind of enliven the facade of this building. The base, so both the base here and the entablature here, they curve very slightly upward. Which is to correct the visual perception of long horizontal lines as kind of sagging in the middle. So they're taking into account the way that the eye perceives long horizontal lines. It's kind of drooping in the middle, and they're curving it upward to correct that. We have columns that also swell slightly in the middle as well. And we have space between the columns that is slightly reduced at the corners. It gives them this sort of sense of stability that very much characterizes this building. However, even though this is obviously a very stable looking building, it doesn't look sort of dead and lifeless. And again, that's because of those slight irregularities that are allowed in. So we're going to look at some of the sculpture that happens on the friezes of this building, and we're going to see a couple of themes that play out. One of them is the idea of sort of Athenian triumph, which we can, imagine that the whole building complex at the Acropolis is about Athenian triumph. So it also has to do with glorifying Athena, who is, of course, Athens' patroness goddess. And we'll see some themes about sort of the enlightened Greeks versus other people who they term barbarians. So everyone who is not a Greek is a barbarian. So there's this triumph of Athenian reason over barbarism that will make it into those sculptures as well. So we're going to start with the east pediment because the west pediment has been lost. And just to sort of give you, you can see that the pediment is arranged in that triangular shape that we're familiar with. So again, they're fitting the sculptures into the composition that they're being given. And what we have here, there are many figures that are lost from this pediment, but we have a depiction of Athena's birth. If those of you who know the myth of Athena know that she was born sort of fully armed, and she kind of springs from Zeus's head as a fully grown woman. We have sculpture on the round here, as what happens in most temple pediments. And just to give you a sense of who these players are from left to right, we have the Helios, who is a sun god. He's partially missing, of course. We have Hercules or Bacchus, either one of them. Both of them are associated with this animal skin below them, so it could be either one. We have the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. We have Iris, who's a messenger goddess. And then we have this missing kind of central figure, which almost certainly would have included Zeus and Athena in the middle. Then we have this group over here of three goddesses that include Hesta and Dione, and then Aphrodite, who's kind of reclining over here to fit into that pediment corner. So just to take a look at this, this grouping of three female figures, just like we saw with that Nike who's adjusting her sandal, the female form underneath these garments is both revealed and concealed. Just by virtue of the way that the fabric lays on them. So we don't have, the garments are quite dripping off the shoulder, although here with Aphrodite's they certainly are. But we do have this fabric that sort of lays on top of the figures, but at the same time reveals them. This is a sculpture that is from one of the metopes. It is from the Doric frieze on the exterior of this building, of the Parthenon. Its outer frieze, just to sort of let you know, had actually 92 fight scenes, so sort of battle scenes, just like the one that we are viewing. The one that we see here pits a mythological sort of figure known as a Lapith. The Lapith were this sort of mythological or legendary people against a centaur. And so this responds to Athenian values. It represents Athenian values. Again, the Lapith embodying the idea of human reason, and then the centaurs representing this kind of unbridled or animal passion. So we have civilization, this is again according to the Greeks, versus or in a position to the sort of barbarism. So everyone who's not a Greek and doesn't have the sort of Greek values. So that's just one of the things that's going on kind of symbolically with this image. But interestingly, I think with this scene is that it is extremely staged. I mean, just look at the position of the Lapith warrior. I mean, just to sort of rhetorically, who would fight like that? You know, who would sort of splay themselves out like this as they are, engaged in a fight? So we have this kind of X-shaped sort of composition right here, and we have a kind of a artificiality that's creeping in. Look at the way that the cloak kind of drapes behind the figure and beautifully frames him. It's completely artificial, yet it's so well executed with these sort of lights and shadows and this beautiful, realistic-looking drape that if you're not thinking about how staged and artificial this looks, you might not even notice it. There's no background happening here, so nothing to distract you from what's going on in the scene. Remember, one of the Greek kind of values of art is to reproduce only the necessary forms, so sort of moderation in terms of representation. And the whole scene is kind of elegant and choreographed. Again, the centaur sort of rears up here. His feet are sort of, implying some kind of motion and struggle. But again, his hands are sort of elegantly positioned behind his back, really shows off his broad, beautifully formed chest, sort of idealized proportions that are making it into the bodies of these figures. So even though this is a battle scene, it's supposed to be sort of chaotic, it's still elegant, it's still choreographed, it's still very, very much balanced. It's so good at doing what it does that you don't even really notice how contrived it is. Oops, sorry. A final procession, or sort of sculpture that we'll look at from the Parthenon is what's known as the procession. This procession was located on a long and continuous frieze that's on the inside of that peristyle colonnade that sort of goes around the perimeter of the temple. So this is actually on the cella, the wall of the cella. The walkers here, we have a couple of male walkers who are sort of interspersed between these groups of female walkers here who are in a procession. I think notably your book points this out, that all of these people that we're seeing here are idealized types rather than actual people. So once again, the Greeks are more interested in sort of showing who the ideal inhabitant of their city is, or of a Greek sort of a city, as opposed to actual real scenes that could have been taking place. We have more kind of idealized figures, we have nice, elegantly proportioned figures, and this sort of just symbolizes a city that is in perfect harmony with itself. Like the previous sculpture that we just looked at, however, the artificiality here, these sort of beautifully paired figures, this lovely kind of rhythmic spacing that happens between them, the lack of any background detail at all, so all of those sort of artificial contrivances of this frieze, we accept it because the frieze itself, the figures itself, are so elegantly conceived. It's even balanced in the sense of forward and backward motion. So we have this sort of slow, plodding, sort of methodical walking ahead by the female figures, and then we have the male figures who are slightly turned, perhaps looking behind, and have a lovely kind of contrapposto stance. Interestingly, I think for the frieze here, in addition to the visual adjustments that are made to the exterior of the Parthenon to sort of correct how the eye perceives lines, the sculptors took into consideration the viewpoint of the viewer. So you'd be looking up at these sculptures from a kind of a low vantage point. And so if you check out the shadows here, you can tell that the upper parts of these friezes are actually carved in higher relief. They stick out further from the background than the lower parts do. So again, they're kind of correcting for the viewpoint of the person who would be gazing up at these sculptures. Remember also that sculptures like this, the friezes, would have been painted, and so they would have very much sort of jumped out at the viewer and put their figures on display. We have a new architectural order that makes it into the classical period. This is the Ionic order. So there are a couple of things that distinguish Doric from Ionic kinds of buildings. Very briefly, this is all in your book, you can see that the column level is different. Here's the Ionic order over on the right, the Doric order on the left. So you'll see that the column is now has a base. You can also see that the proportions of the column's shafts are much slenderer than the Doric. So the shaft is 9 times taller than its base is wide, so it has a more slender proportion. The flutes on the shafts are deeper, they're narrower, and they're also set off with these tiny flat surfaces. So it's sort of a higher degree of texture that makes it into these into the flutes. The capitals of the Ionic order have a very characteristic kind of spiral at either end. These are known as volutes, and I think that they're the easiest way to identify an Ionic building, is that they have those volutes on the capitals. The entablature has a 3-register architrave, so there are these 3 registers. Usually no sculpture happens in the architrave. And then it does have a continuous sculpted or decorated frieze. So instead of having triglyphs in metopes, and then the sculpture happens in the metopes, for the Ionic order, the entablature features this continuously carved frieze. So those are just, again, the distinguishing characteristics of the Ionic order. We can see them happening in a building called the Erechtheion, which is it's a temple that is dedicated to many gods. It's a smaller temple than the Parthenon. The reason that it's sort of asymmetrical, you can see these sorts of building protrusions on the side, we'll talk about this porch in just a moment, is that, again, it did house objects that are associated to various gods. This temple commemorated a couple of mythical sites. It is the site that, according to Greek mythology, there was a challenge between the goddess Athena and the god Poseidon for who was going to be Athens' patron. So they had this contest where each of them made a gift to the city of Athens. Poseidon strikes his trident into a rock and he gives Athens a spring. Athena, on the other hand, gave Athens an olive tree, and she ended up winning the contest. So this, the Erechtheion houses kind of relics of both of those sacred events. It houses a wooden statue of Athena, an ancient wooden statue that was made out of olive wood, and it also houses the rock that Poseidon is said to have struck. And so this is again celebrating the city of Athens, celebrating its special relationship to the goddess Athena. So if you look, just sort of a quick comparison here between the Doric and the Ionic versions of temples. We have the Erechtheion's facade over here on the left. We have the temple at Aegina over here on the right, and I think that you can very readily see how much taller and more slender the Ionic version is, so the columns are much more narrow than the columns over here in the Doric order. Also those characteristic volutes that happen in the Ionic, as opposed to these plain capitals over here. The columns all have bases, whereas these columns are all sort of firmly attached to the ground without a base. And then, of course, this continuous frieze that happens right below the pediment. Over here in the Doric order, it is divided into triglyphs and metopes. So again, just to help fix those differences in your mind. And so the last image that we're going to look at today is an additional part of the Erechtheion. This is known as the Porch of the Maidens, and it is filled with columns, I guess, if you want to call them that. They're called caryatids. It took me a minute there. And so these are figures, sort of freestanding sculptures in the round that take the place of the columns in a normal Ionic kind of a temple. And so the women themselves have a kind of contrapposto stance. You see that their weight is on the, sort of one leg here. The other knee is allowed to project out into the viewer's space slightly. So that gives the effort, or the sort of appearance that holding up this temple is effortless. They're sort of, even though they have to hold this great weight on their head, they're still just sort of balancing it all on one leg. Interestingly, also, I think, sort of cleverly, the fact that they have this straight leg here causes their garments to fall straight down in these wrinkles and folds that mimic the flutes of an Ionic column. So they're kind of playing with this idea of the texture of those flutes that also appears in the texture of their garments. Originally, these maidens had held in one of their hand libation vessels, so vessels for holding wine. It's believed that the Greeks believed that the tomb of a mythical king was underneath this porch, and so it was traditional to pour libations to the Greek dead, and so that was one of the things that these women were sort of in constant act of doing. And so that's going to conclude the High Classical lecture here, and you can go on over to the Late Classical and Hellenistic period when you have a chance.